The girl came barefoot through the mud, her hem torn and soaked, trailing like a wounded ribbon behind her. Each step left a small, trembling print in the muck, as if the land itself recoiled from her presence. She was 12, though small for it, with wrists wrapped in twine and lips chapped from wind and silence. Behind her, the man tugging the rope carved a date staggered from the weight of his whiskey, not the girl. His belt clinked with a flask, and he wore cruelty like it was stitched to his coat. Rain fell soft but steady, dousing the dust-drawing townsfolk to their windows. They watched behind curtains, some clutching their teacups, others whispering to no one in particular. It was not the first child led through town like this. Nor would it be the last, so long as hunger bought silence, and silence made men rich. The girl did not cry. She did not lift her chin. But something in the set of her eyes, gray like storm water, wide and unblinking, unsettled the watching world. She looked as if she'd already seen the worst of living and found it hollow. Across the street near the feed store, Eli McCrae paused beneath the porch overhang, sack of oats resting against his shoulder. He didn't look at the girl first. He looked at Carver, then at the rope, then finally her. And when their eyes met just briefly, he looked away like he'd touched something too raw. Eli was not a loud man. Folks called him a good one, mostly because he didn't ask for much and stayed out of the way. He'd been a husband once, a father maybe. That part was whispered too softly to be certain. What was known was this: he ran a modest ranch 2 miles past the chapel and had no livestock that needed a child. So when he crossed the street in the rain and stood between Carver and the girl, heads turned. "Were you talking?" her Eli asked, voice low, like thunder still curled up in a cloud. "Saloon back room," Carver grunted. "Some gamblers need help pouring drinks, and she owes." Eli's eyes slid to the girl's arms. The rope had carved red into the skin. Her shoes were gone. Her dress, no more than thin muslin, hung damp and patched. "How much you say she owes?" Carver raised a brow. $20. Labor debt. Her pa's gone west. Never paid the miner's fee. Eli reached into his coat, pulled out a wad of bills. Rain dampened the corners before he passed them over. "She ain't yours anymore." "Now hold on." Eli didn't raise his voice, didn't move his stance. "Just said you don't want to finish that sentence, Carver." That was all. Carver took the money, grumbling as if the cold had bitten him, and turned back down the street toward the saloon. Behind curtains, teacups paused midair. A dog barked once, then stopped. Miss Varela Dunn, matron of the boarding house, stood at her porch in her lavender shawl, mouth tight. She didn't wave, but she didn't look away either. Eli turned to the girl. She didn't flinch, though she still wouldn't meet his gaze. Her chin tilted down, not in submission, but exhaustion. "You hungry?" he asked. She blinked once. That was all. "I've got bread. Barn's warm." He didn't touch her, didn't lead her. He simply turned and walked, and she followed. The road to his ranch was wet clay in memory. Every step squelched. But the girl did not lag. She walked like someone who'd been told long ago that stopping meant punishment. They didn't speak, not when they passed the schoolhouse where bells no longer rang for girls like her. Not when they crossed the wooden bridge that creaked like an old man's knees. Not even when they reached the weather-worn fence that framed Eli's modest home. He opened the barn door first, lit a lantern. The warm scent of hay, worn leather, and cedar oil drifted out like an invitation. He pointed to a clean patch of straw near the stall. "You can sleep there. I'll bring you supper." Still no words, but her body sagged a little, as if her bones had waited days to collapse. By the time Eli returned with food, a chunk of bread, a boiled egg, and a dented tin cup of milk, she was curled like a cat, arms hugging her chest, eyes wide open. He set the tray down gently. "Eat what you want. Leave the rest." She didn't touch it until he'd gone. Inside the house, Eli stared at the cold hearth. He hadn't lit it in weeks. No need when you sleep alone. He did now, though. Something about the rain felt colder than usual. The next morning, she was up before him. He found the barn swept, his saddle hung, and the water trough full. She stood by the fence watching the sky. Her eyes had no interest in his. "Name?" he asked. She blinked. Nothing. He tried again. "What should I call you?" She opened her mouth and closed it, as if names were something she'd once owned but traded long ago for safety. So he didn't ask again. At the general store that week, voices rose louder than usual when Eli walked in. "You to Keenan strays?" now asked Thad from behind the counter, trying for humor but missing the mark. Eli didn't smile. Some strays got more sense than the men who abandoned them. By the time he reached the porch, he heard Miss Varella's voice trailing behind him. "A man alone with a girl like that, it ain't proper." He said nothing, but the wind that carried her words back to him also carried the girl's silence, and that silence had weight. That night he left a folded blanket beside her. She didn't thank him, didn't look up. But when he passed by an hour later, the blanket was tucked around her shoulders and her eyes were closed. He watched her chest rise and fall slow, and even as though for the first time in a long while, her breath no longer belonged to fear. 3 days passed, then 4. She still didn't speak, but her hands moved with purpose, feeding hens, wiping down the trough, folding the oilcloth. Each task done as if it mattered, as if she mattered. He noticed she stopped flinching when the door creaked, that she slept with her hands unclenched, that the twitch in her jaw had quieted. One evening just before dusk, Eli came into the barn carrying a tin of peaches. He found her drawing on the wood beam with a piece of coal shapes that made no sense to him. Circles, lines, stars. She looked up startled, but he only said peaches are sweeter than they look. He left the tin and walked out. Later he saw the stars again on the post near the gate, just faint marks fading fast. He didn't erase them. He left his boots by the door that night, not because they were wet, but because he didn't want to wake her. The next morning she was sitting on the porch, arms folded, waiting. "You gonna ask me again?" she said, voice hoarse and used. Eli blinked. "Ask what my name?" He nodded once, waited. She looked at the sky, then back at him. "Junie." He didn't smile, just said Junie then. "You hungry?" And for the first time she nodded. That night, as the town whispered about scandal and shadows, Eli added a second-place setting at the table. The chair was too tall. Her feet didn't touch the ground, but she ate slow and steady, chewing, like the food might disappear if rushed. He didn't ask about her past. She didn't ask about his wife's photograph sitting face down on the mantel. But before bed, Junie turned to him and asked, "Will I have to leave again?" Eli looked at her, really looked, not at the dirt on her sleeves or the tightness in her mouth, but at the way she asked, like someone braced for the answer to hurt. "No," he said softly. "Not unless you want to." She nodded once. Her hands didn't tremble. In the barn she lay beneath, the wool blanket eyes wide open again, but this time not from fear. Outside the rain fell in soft threads, and the land soaked in silence listened. Eli McCrae was not a man of questions, and Junie was not a girl of answers. So the day stretched quiet between them, stitched together by chores, glances, and the unspoken agreement that neither would demand what the other could not give. Mornings came with the lowing of the cow and the pale blue stretch of sky that always looked like it might tear. Eli rose before the sun, the way he always had, moving through his work with the rhythm of habit. When he came out to the barn, Junie was already up, sometimes feeding the hens, sometimes brushing dust off the plow blade with a rag too thin to clean anything. She never asked what needed doing. She simply watched him first and mirrored the motion. There was something solemn about the way she held a broom or turned the handle of the water pump. Not the energy of a child learning a task, but the practiced hush of someone who had long since understood that doing meant surviving. She moved like a ghost who hadn't yet decided if she was welcome among the living. Eli didn't try to make her laugh. He didn't ask why she folded her bread in quarters or why she never took the last sip of milk. He simply made room, a second hook for her coat, a shorter bucket near the well, an extra slice of peach set to the side without comment. It was the kind of care that didn't announce itself, the kind a girl like Junie noticed most. On the 5th morning, she cut her hand on a rusty nail while sweeping the barn floor. The sound she made wasn't a cry, but a sharp intake of breath, the kind that's quickly swallowed so no one hears. Eli turned at the sound and was at her side before she could hide the blood with her skirt. He didn't scold, just held out his hand palm open. She stared at it for a moment, then placed her own inside. Her fingers were cold. The cut wasn't deep, but it would scar if left alone. Eli led her to the house in silence, warmed a kettle, and found a strip of clean cloth from an old linen drawer. She watched him work, her gray eyes narrowed, searching his face for something. Disgust, pity, fear, but there was none. He wrapped her hand and tied the knot with a tenderness that made her chest twist in a way she didn't understand. "That'll hold," he murmured. Junie nodded once and pulled her hand away. The blood had started to dry beneath her nails. Still, her grip lingered longer than she meant it to. Later that day, Eli caught her scrubbing the cloth in a bucket beside the barn, her thumb pressed into the fibers like she was punishing it. He didn't interrupt. The town, meanwhile, was learning to gossip again. At the church steps, Miss Varela Dunn lowered her voice, but not her suspicion. "It's not proper," she told the preacher's wife. "A girl alone with a man like that? No matter how decent he is, people talk." Thatch Brennan, the blacksmith, overheard but said nothing. He knew the sound of loneliness when he saw it, and he saw it in both their eyes. The town had a short memory for kindness and a long one for scandal. One afternoon, Junie wandered the edge of the property, chasing the wind more than any destination. She found a small wooden box half buried near the tree line. Inside, a faded photograph, two figures on a porch, a man with a slight smile, and a woman with a ribbon in her hair. The same woman whose face sat turned down on the mantel inside Eli's house. Junie didn't ask. That night, she set the photo gently on the barn shelf beside the lantern, upright, as if returning something sacred to its altar. Eli saw it the next morning and froze breath shallow. He didn't move it. That evening after supper, Junie placed 2 tin cups on the table without being asked. She didn't look at him when she did it, just poured the milk slowly, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, the bandage peeking out like a story half told. The storm came just after midnight, thunder low and rolling rain pelting the rooftop in sheets. Eli lit a lantern and stepped out to check the barn. Inside, Junie was curled in her straw bed blanket pulled high, but her eyes were open, staring at the rafters. "Storms pass in," he said, voice calm. She nodded, eyes still fixed on the ceiling. "Don't like the dark when it's loud." He knelt beside her, rested the lantern on the ground. The glow flickered across her face, casting her into something older than 12. Something shaped by more than weather. "You safe here," he said. "Ain't nobody come in for you." Junie blinked. "People come anyway. They just don't knock." Eli didn't answer. He placed the lantern beside her and walked out. But before he closed the door, he looked back once, just long enough to see her hand reach out toward the warmth of the light. By the week's end, the silence between them had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was a bridge, delicate but standing. On the 7th day, Junie left a crust of bread at the barn threshold, crumbled into neat quarters. Eli watched her from the porch. She whispered something to the wind before stepping back inside. He couldn't hear the words, but he felt them. That night, he set a small potted herb on her shelf. Mint. It had survived his wife's touch, and now hers. The following morning, Junie swept the porch steps. She sang under her breath, off-key quiet but real. Eli paused with the feed bucket halfway to the coop and listened. Not to the tune, but to the fact of it. The sound of a girl remembering something other than fear. And then, as if sensing his attention, she stopped. "I can do the garden too," she said, almost a challenge. He nodded. "Then it's yours." From that day on, the vegetables were weeded, the paths swept. She tied string for the tomatoes with more care than most gave to quilts. Every seed she planted was tucked in like a promise. One afternoon, he brought her a pair of boots, scuffed secondhand but sturdy. She didn't say thank you, but she wore them the next morning, laces tied tight. The town's murmurs grew louder. Children at school asked Miss Varela who the girl was, with the boots too big and the eyes too tired. One said she was a thief, another said she was a witch. Miss Varela silenced them with a look and wrote Junie's name on a blank page in the rollbook. Just in case, she whispered to herself. Back on the ranch, Junie found a length of red ribbon nailed to the fence post. She took it without asking and tied it around the mint pot. That night, Eli found her asleep beside the hearth, not in the barn. Her arms were curled around the wool blanket, her boots resting beside the fire steam rising faintly from their toes. He didn't wake her. Instead, he stepped outside into the cold and lit his pipe, watching the stars blink open one by one. Somewhere behind him, a girl with bruised hands dreamed without crying. The wind rustled the dry stalks. A barn owl called once into the night. And Eli McRae, who had once buried his whole heart beneath silence, stood on his porch and felt it beat again. The clouds rolled in low that morning, heavy with the smell of soil and coming rain. The kind of storm that didn't ask permission. Eli stood at the edge of the north field, testing the sky the way a man tests the weight of a memory. He had seen storms like this before, when the ground turned slick in minutes and trees bent like old knees. He motioned to Junie, who was checking the new fence posts, to come in. She nodded once, the way she always did when words weren't needed. But the sky had other plans. Halfway across the pasture, the wind snapped through the grass and dropped its warning. Thunder cracked open the silence, sharp and sudden. Then came the rain. Not a drizzle, but a wall, straight and cold and blinding. Junie slipped in the mud, legs folding beneath her. She hit the earth hard. A gasp left her mouth, not from pain, but something deeper. Something startled loose from the hollow she'd kept it in. Eli was at her side before she could rise. He knelt, his hands hovering just above her arms, waiting. She looked up at him, soaked hair plastered across her cheek, mud streaking her forehead like war paint. And then for the first time she spoke. "I didn't cry when Mama left." It came out like a confession dragged from deep water, shaky, defiant, raw. Eli stilled, his hand lowered to her shoulder, gentle, present. He didn't rush her. The storm roared around them, but neither flinched. Junie's voice shook, but her eyes stayed steady. She said she'd come back when the sunflowers bloomed, but she never even saw them sprout. Eli didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. He just pulled his coat off and draped it over her shoulders, shielding her from the worst of the rain. They sat like that a while, knee-deep in mud and memory. Later in the shed, safe from the storm, Junie's eyes followed the water as it dripped from the rafters. One drop, then another. "She had a baby," she whispered. "My brother. He came too early." I held him. He was quiet. I don't think he blinked even once. Eli leaned against the opposite wall, his coat dripping onto the wood floor. His heart was a tight knot of silence and sorrow. "I named him Jack," she said. "No one asked me to. But someone had to." She didn't cry, not then, but her hand curled into her lap like it was holding something small, something that had once breathed and now didn't. Eli nodded, not to offer comfort, but to show he'd heard her. All of her. In that old tool shed, something shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but like frost giving way to thaw. They didn't speak the rest of the afternoon, but the silence was no longer an absence. It was a shelter. That evening, Junie set the table. 2 plates, 2 forks. She folded the napkin square and centered. When Eli sat down, she passed him the breadbasket before he could reach for it. "I don't like it when folks yell," she said suddenly, as if picking up a thread from hours ago. "It don't matter what they say, just the noise of it." Eli stirred his stew. "I don't like it neither." A small smile pulled at the corner of her mouth like it hadn't been used in years. He noticed but said nothing. As days passed, she spoke more. Not stories, not yet, but bits. Questions, observations. "Why don't you put the mirror up in the front room? Was that your wife's shawl in the chest?" "Do chickens ever miss their eggs?" Eli answered some. "Let others sit." The rhythm of their life changed in small ways. Junie began humming again, only in the garden, when she thought no one was listening. Eli started setting out an extra biscuit at breakfast, even on days she rose late. She asked for a second blanket when the nights turned colder, and he brought her 3. In town, eyes followed them closer now. At the dry goods store, Carver Dade watched from the porch, a slow smile spreading like rot. "Rancher's got himself a housemaid," he muttered. Eli heard. He paused, hand tight around the sack of flour, but said nothing. Just met the man's eyes and held them long enough to make Dade look away. Junie noticed. Her spine straightened. Not in pride, but in protection. She had learned early that most men don't defend what isn't theirs, and she was learning that Eli did without needing to own a thing. One afternoon, she found a stack of books in a trunk in the attic. Dusty spines pages yellowed at the edges. She carried them down like treasure. "Can I?" she asked, laying them across the kitchen table. Eli looked up from the ledger. They were hers. "I'll be careful." "I know." She started reading by lantern light, first slow tracing the words with her finger, then faster. One night, Eli passed the doorway and heard her reading aloud to no one, just for the sound of it, just to believe her voice could fill a room and not be punished. He didn't interrupt. That week the preacher visited, said the church board had concerns about appearances. A man alone with a girl, no legal bond, it makes tongues wag. Eli stared at the man for a long moment, then said, tongues wag, whether you feed the poor or ignore him. Makes no difference to me. The preacher left his boots heavier than when he came. Junie didn't ask about it, but that night when she placed the firewood beside the hearth, she added an extra log. That was the night of the fever. Junie woke coughing, skin-flushed breath tight in her chest. Eli heard the sound before the rooster called and came running. She was burning. He soaked claws, brought cool water, stayed by her side through every fit. Once delirious, she cried out for Mama. It made Eli flinch, but he didn't leave. He sat beside her for 2 nights straight, feeding broth by the spoonful, whispering steady reassurances. Her hand gripped his shirt, once knuckles white. He covered it with his own, grounding her. By the 3rd morning, the fever broke. She woke with a cracked voice and asked, you stayed. He nodded, too tired for words. She blinked slowly. Thank you. Eli looked down at her small hand, the bandage long gone, now wrapped in quilt. Your family, Junie, he said. She looked at him a long time as if testing the truth of it, then whispered, no one ever said that to me. They didn't speak for the rest of the day. But that evening, Junie walked out to the barn, picked up the broken plow handle, and sanded it smooth. Later, when Eli passed the porch, he saw something new carved into the rail. Not initials, not flowers. Just one word, Jack. It wasn't about the dead baby brother. It was about memory, about claiming something she wasn't supposed to keep. Eli sat beside her, said nothing, and she leaned her head on his shoulder like it had always been there. The first trouble came not with fists or flames, but with a knock on the door, a knock too loud for kindness. Junie was sweeping the porch when she heard it. Eli stood by the woodpile stacking ash logs. He straightened slowly, his back stiffening before his hands did. The knock came again, insistent, official. When he opened the door, Carver Dade stood there with 2 deputies, their stars crooked on their chests like they'd been pinned in anger. We got papers, Carver said, waving a folded sheet like a flag of war. That girl's been reported missing. Orphan property of the state, indentured out by contract. Sheriff says she needs returning. Eli didn't blink. She ain't property, and she ain't leaving. Junie had come to stand behind him, silent, barefoot in the doorway. One deputy cleared his throat. This your daughter? Then Eli didn't hesitate. She's mine. That's so. Carver leaned in his mouth, sour with whiskey. Funny how she didn't say that when I found her knee-deep in debt work in her keep. She was 12, Eli said, quiet as thunder rolling in the hills. No child owes that kind of debt. The man smirked. Then prove she's yours. Papers, what witness? Junie stepped forward, small but steady. Her voice didn't tremble. He fed me when I hadn't eaten, fixed my hand when no one cared, sat beside me 3 nights through fever. I don't know what makes a father, but that's close enough. The porch had drawn a crowd. Word traveled fast when scandal knocked. Miss Varela stood in the street, arms crossed tight. Thatch Brennan emerged from his smithy black, dust still on his face. A murmur rolled through the townsfolk like wind through brittle leaves. Carver laughed, sharp and thin. You all gonna let a man claim a girl like a lost calf? It was Miss Varela who answered. We're gonna let a man defend a child he didn't make because he's the only one who ever did. The preacher arrived out of breath. There's no law says love needs a paper. Carver's grin twitched. Don't need a law to know what ain't right. You mean what ain't convenient, Eli said, taking 1 step down. This girl's seen more decency in 6 weeks than most see in 6 years. You want to take her? You'll do it in front of all these folks. You'll take her from my hands. He held them out open, empty, unshaking. Carver didn't move. The silence between them was tight as a drawn rope. Then, wordless, Carver shoved the paper into his vest and spat into the dust. Won't forget this, he muttered. Eli nodded. Neither will I. They left with their boots heavy and the eyes of the town burning holes in their backs. But that night vengeance came with smoke. Junie woke first. The barn was full of it, black and bitter, curling through the rafters like a curse. She screamed Eli's name before her feet hit the ground. Eli burst out the house with a bucket, eyes wide with fear, sharper than flame. Together they fought him, dousing hay, her dragging the frightened mule free. Embers landed on her sleeves, searing holes through fabric and skin. She didn't stop. Neighbors came running. Miss Varela with wet quilts, Thatch with barrels, hands buckets, boots stamping fire. When the last ember hissed into mud, the barn still stood, but barely. Junie collapsed beside the trough, coughing streaked in soot. Eli knelt beside her, cupping her blistered hands. You should have stayed inside. You shouldn't be been alone. You didn't argue. They sat on the ground, steam rising around them in the cold. Somewhere above the sky was clear again, like it hadn't just watched them burn. By morning, the damage was sharp and sobering. The roof would need replacing. The stall doors had scorched black. But Junie's drawing, the one etched in charcoal on the inside beam, the sunrise with no door, was still there, faint but untouched. Eli touched it gently, then turned to Junie. Let's build it again. Better. She nodded, jaw set. With a door this time. That evening, the preacher rang the schoolhouse bell. Not for class, not for sermon, but to call the town. People gathered, lanterns in hand. And on the steps of the chapel, Miss Varela read from a page not written by law, but by memory. This girl, Junie, was bought bruised and left in the rain. We let that happen. But she stayed. She worked. She gave more kindness than she got. So I'm telling this town plain, if anyone lays a hand on her, again they lay it on me. Thatch stepped forward, voice thick. She's one of us now. From the crowd, a boy raised his hand and said she helped me with my stutter. Another girl whispered she gave me her bread at school. And slowly the townsfolk clapped, not loud or wild, but steady, like they were trying to fix something, like maybe they had just remembered how. The preacher turned and looked up at the bell tower. Then he said, we won't ring it again for child labor. Not in this town. The bell stayed silent from that day forward. That night back at the ranch, Eli carved a new sign for the gate, Juniper Ranch. He didn't tell her why, but when Junie passed it the next morning, she touched the edge of the wood with one finger and smiled. Not big, just enough. Winter rolled and soft as ash settling over the town, with a hush that made even the saloon piano play slower. Snow gathered along rooftops, coating the world in a kind of mercy, and at the edge of town, Juniper Ranch stood like a story half told. Junie woke earlier now. She moved through the house with quiet certainty, feeding hens, checking fences, folding linens beside the hearth. Her sleeves were no longer torn. Her hands bore faint scars, but they were steady, sure. She no longer paused before entering a room. No longer looked to Eli for permission, only direction. She was 13 now, and though she still slept in the barn some nights by choice, she had begun leaving the lantern, lit not out of fear, but as if to say, I'm still here. Eli watched her from the porch most mornings, steam rising from his tin mug, the sunrise brushing her figure in gold. He said little as always, but his gaze lingered longer than before. A man could live a lifetime without knowing peace, and still recognize it when it arrived in boots 2 sizes too big in a braid that never stayed tied. One morning he handed her a small box hand carved from cedar. Inside a bell. Wooden. Hollow. It don't ring, he said. Didn't want it to. Just figured if a thing's meant to call someone, it ought to ask, not command. Junie turned it in her hands, then placed it above the door on a hook she'd hammered herself. Doesn't need to ring, she said softly. I hear it anyway. The ranch grew that winter not in acres, but in heart. Miss Varela sent old blankets. Thatch Brennan brought nails and new wood. The preacher offered books for Junie's shelf. They didn't call it charity. They called it neighboring. And Junie accepted it not with shame, but with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned the difference between kindness and pity. Eli's hands had begun to stiffen with the cold, but he never let her lift the heaviest loads. She argued sometimes in that gentle way she was learning. I can carry, that she'd say, arms crossed, chin raised. I know he'd answer, handing it over anyway. Then came the letter. No return name, just the stamp of the state. Eli read it once, then burned it in the stove. Junie watched the flame eat it piece by piece. Was it about me, she asked. He nodded. Do I need to leave? He looked up sharply, eyes fierce. You're not going anywhere. She believed him. And yet for the next week she moved a little slower, laughed a little less, as if the shadow of that paper still lingered in the walls. Eli noticed. He didn't ask, but he left a new pair of gloves on the porch rail, just her size. When she found them, she sat down on the step and cried, not from fear, but from the way something so small could say stay. One snow-choked evening, a wagon arrived at the gate wheels crunching like bones beneath the frost. A stranger stepped down, a girl no older than Junie had been when she arrived, barefoot, shivering hair matted with sleet. No name, no bag, just a look in her eyes that Junie recognized instantly. Eli stepped forward. "You lost, miss." The girl didn't answer. Her mouth opened, then closed. Junie moved beside Eli and took his hand without asking. "She's not lost," Junie said, her voice even. "She's just not been found yet." They took the girl in. The townsfolk didn't question it this time. They brought firewood and soup, socks and ribbons. The bell at the schoolhouse stayed quiet, and no one asked who the girl belonged to. Belonging, it seemed, had changed its shape. On Junie's 14th birthday, Eli made her a bookcase. He carved her name into the top with careful hands. She filled it in hours, not just with books, but with feathers, folded notes, a tin button from the girl's coat. The girl, now called Lark, slept curled beside the hearth like Junie once had. "You're her Eli now," he told her once, watching them draw side by side. Junie smiled. "You still are." The snow melted slow that spring. Wildflowers pushed through stubborn soil, as if unsure the world was ready for color again. At the edge of town, Juniper Ranch bloomed with new life, more than could be measured in stock or soil. Children came, women without kin, men with nothing but hope and calloused hands. The ranch didn't turn them away. No one spoke of Carver Date anymore. His name faded like smoke, like old shame. Junie stood taller now. When she walked through town, heads nodded. Doors opened. She was no longer the girl bought in mud. She was the one who stayed, and in staying changed everything. One afternoon, while repairing the gate, she looked over her shoulder and said, "Do you think I'll ever stop remembering what it was like before?" Eli leaned on the post beside her, wiping his brow. "No," he said, "but I reckon remembering is how you keep from becoming the ones who've forgotten." She nodded. "Good. I don't want to forget. I want to be the reason someone else gets remembered." And she was. Long after that winter, long after the snow returned and melted again. After Eli's hands grew too tired to work, and Junie's voice grew strong enough to carry across rooms. She never rang the bell. She didn't have to, because everyone who stepped through that gate already knew. This was a place where no child was forgotten, no name erased, no scar left unacknowledged. And those who stayed didn't just find shelter. They found home. And if you're listening now, maybe you're standing in the doorway of something broken. Maybe you've been dragged in the mud or made to believe you were less. But I promise you, someone's waiting. Someone with calloused hands and a coat for your shoulders. You don't need to earn it. You only need to arrive. Because sometimes the bell doesn't ring. It doesn't have to. Sometimes love just opens the door.